Berlin, April 22, 1945. The meeting had been going for less than an hour when something happened that had never happened before. Adolf Hitler stopped talking about victory. For 12 years he'd stood in front of generals, ministers and the German people and spoken about destiny, about a 1,000-year Reich, about the inevitable triumph of a vision so complete, so total, so consuming that it had reorganized an entire civilization around the belief that he could not be wrong. On the afternoon of April 22, in a concrete room 15 meters below a burning city, surrounded by generals who had run out of good news to deliver, Hitler looked at the maps, he looked at the positions, he looked at the numbers, and then he screamed. Not orders, not strategy, not the controlled fury of a man redirecting his energy towards a new plan. He screamed the way a structure screams when the last load-bearing wall gives way. The sound of something that had been held up by will alone, finally encountering the limit of what will can do. When it was over, in the silence that followed, he said something that no one in the room had ever heard him say. He said the war was lost. The man who started it all had 48 hours left, and what he did with them tells you everything you need to know about what he had always been.
The Second World War did not end on a battlefield. It ended in a room 4 meters wide and 6 meters long, 15 meters below the surface of a city that was being destroyed in real time by the largest military force ever assembled on European soil. It ended with a man who had reorganized an entire civilization around his own certainty, discovering in the span of one afternoon that certainty had a limit. By April 1945, the arithmetic was irreversible. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers stood at the gates of Berlin. 6,000 tanks, 40,000 artillery pieces. The Red Army that Hitler had dismissed in 1941 as a house of cards that would collapse at the first serious blow had absorbed everything the Wehrmacht could deliver for 4 years and had come back, angrier, stronger, and carrying with it the accumulated weight of 27 million Soviet dead. Against this, Germany had 1 million men, most of them below strength. Old men in the Volkssturm, boys with Panzerfausts, units that existed on paper and had ceased to exist in reality weeks ago, still being moved around maps in a bunker by a man who had not been above ground in months. The battle for Berlin was never going to be decided by the fighting above ground. It was going to be decided by what happened below it.
To understand what Berlin was in April 1945, you must understand what it had been 6 years earlier. In 1939, it was the capital of a regime that had reorganized an entire continent around its own vision of what history was supposed to mean. The streets were clean, the economy was functioning. The rallies filled stadiums with people who believed, genuinely, completely, with the particular intensity of people who had been given a story that makes sense of everything, that what they were part of was the beginning of something permanent. The war that followed had consumed everything that belief was built on. The Allied bombing campaigns had already reduced large sections of Berlin to rubble before the Soviet assault began. The city that 2.5 million civilians were still living in because the Nazi authorities had made no serious effort to evacuate them, because acknowledging the need to evacuate was acknowledging that the city might fall, was a landscape of collapsed buildings and burning streets, and the particular quality of smoke that comes from a modern city being unmade industrial scale. Above the bunker, the sounds of Soviet artillery had been audible since April 21st. Not distant, not theoretical. The physical vibration of shells landing in the government district above. The Reich Chancellery, the Reichstag, the ministries of a regime that had once administered an empire from these buildings and was now administering nothing. Below, the Führerbunker had been Hitler's primary residence since January. a complex of 18 rooms buried 15 metres under the Reich Chancellery garden. Its walls a metre thick, its air filtered and recycled, its occupants cut off from the city above by concrete and by the particular psychological insulation of men who'd spent years telling themselves that the situation was manageable. By April, it was not manageable. By April, it had not been manageable for a long time. The question was simply when the last person in the bunker would say so out loud. On April 22nd, Hitler said so himself.
The Soviet plan was built around 3 army groups converging on Berlin simultaneously. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's forces would break through the Seelow Heights east of the city and drive along the main road to the capital. Marshal Ivan Konev's forces would encircle from the south. Marshal Rokossovsky would protect the northern flank. The Seelow Heights cost more than anyone planned. The Germans had pulled back just beyond the Soviet artillery barrage and waited, so that when the barrage lifted and the Red Army advanced, it walked into prepared positions on high ground in the soft April mud. Zhukov, under political pressure from Stalin to move faster, made a mistake, sending his tank armies through the infantry that had already stalled, creating the chaos of a traffic jam under fire on roads that had never been designed for armoured columns. For 3 days, the Soviets battered their way up the heights and through the German lines. 33,000 Soviet soldiers died on the Seelow Heights alone, 12,000 Germans. On April 19th, the lines broke and the Red Army accelerated west. By April 25th, Berlin was surrounded. The ring was closed. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers and their equipment formed a perimeter around a city of 2.5 million civilians and whatever remained of Germany's capacity to fight, which was, by this point, significantly less than the maps in the bunker suggested. Inside the city, the defence was improvised with the particular desperation of men who understood that what they were defending was not a military position, but the physical space around a bunker. Makeshift barricades, Volkssturm units of men over 60 and boys under 16, given Panzerfausts and told to stop Soviet tanks with handheld weapons. Foreign Waffen-SS volunteers, Scandinavian, Dutch, French, fighting in the streets of a city that was not theirs for a regime that had already lost. The Red Army fought for every block, every canal, every railway station. The tactics were the same ones Chuikov had learned at Stalingrad. Small teams of infantry, engineers, flamethrowers and artillery working together to blast through buildings one room at a time. The city that had taken years to build was being taken apart in days. Above the streets, the smoke was visible for miles. Below them, the maps were still being updated.
On the night of April 28th, in a ceremony that lasted approximately 40 minutes, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. The paperwork was completed by a municipal official who'd been brought to the bunker for the purpose. The witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. The wedding cake was served in the mat room where hours earlier Hitler had been issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. Eva Braun wore a black dress. Hitler wore his uniform. They'd known each other for 15 years. She had spent most of that time as a secret, kept away from the public, never officially acknowledged, present in the private life of the most public man in Germany while being completely absent from his public one. She had attempted suicide twice during their relationship. She had spent the war in relative comfort while the war consumed everything around her. She had come to the bunker voluntarily when she could have left. She had chosen to be here, in this room, on this night. At the end of the ceremony, Hitler was asked to confirm that he was of pure Aryan descent and free of hereditary disease. He confirmed both. The regime that had built its entire architecture of law and identity on the concept of racial purity processed its paperwork in a concrete room while the Soviet artillery shook the ceiling above. They had approximately 36 hours left.
What passed between them in those hours, the historical record preserves only in fragments, in the accounts of the secretaries and staff who were present, in the documents that survived, in the memoir of Traudl Junge, Hitler's personal secretary, who was one of the last people to speak with him before the end. Junge records that Hitler seemed calm, that he spoke about his dog, that he thanked the staff for their service, that he gave cyanide capsules to those who wanted them, that he tested the cyanide on his dog first to make sure it worked. The man who had sent millions to their deaths tested the method of his own death on a dog.
April 30th, 1945. Above the bunker, Soviet forces were fighting for the Reichstag. The building that had once been Germany's parliament burned in 1933 in circumstances that had never been fully explained, used as propaganda symbol by the Soviet command because flying the red banner over it by May 1st, International Workers' Day, had been designated as the symbolic moment of victory. The fighting for the Reichstag was some of the bloodiest of the entire Berlin operation, room by room, floor by floor. The building had been converted into a fortress, and the Germans defending it fought with the particular intensity of men who understood that this was the last building and there was nothing behind it. Below the Reichstag, in the bunker, Hitler said his final goodbyes. He shook hands with the staff. He spoke briefly with Goebbels, who had already decided to die in the bunker with his wife and his 6 children. 6 children whose ages ranged from 4 to 12, who would be given cyanide by their parents because Magda Goebbels had decided they could not be allowed to live in a world without National Socialism. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private study. Eva Braun took cyanide. Hitler took cyanide and shot himself simultaneously, whether he did not fully trust the cyanide or because he wanted to ensure the outcome. The sources do not agree. The sound of the shot was heard in the corridor outside. The staff entered and carried the bodies to the Reich Chancellery garden above, where they were placed in a shell crater and burnt with aviation fuel. The Soviet artillery continued without interruption. The city continued burning. The war continued for 8 more days. Nobody above ground noticed the moment it ended below. On May 2nd, 1945, General Helmuth Weidling surrendered Berlin to the Red Army. What remained of the city was a landscape that required a new vocabulary to describe. Not ruins in any conventional sense, but the physical evidence of what happens when the full destructive capacity of the mid-20th century is applied to a modern European capital for weeks without pause. The Reichstag was taken. The red banner was raised above it. Photographs were taken that would become among the most reproduced images of the 20th century. Soviet soldiers against the burning skyline, the physical fact of victory expressed in smoke and concrete and a flag. The cost of the Berlin operation was staggering, even by the standards of a war that had already made staggering costs routine. The Red Army lost at least 80,000 soldiers killed in less than 3 weeks. German military dead may have reached 100,000. Civilian dead are harder to count. Estimates range from 20,000 to 100,000, compressed into the final days of a battle fought in streets where civilians were told there was nowhere to go. The Soviet troops who entered the city came with the weight of everything the German army had done in the Soviet Union. The 27 million Soviet dead, the burnt villages, the siege of Leningrad, the occupation policies that had treated the Slavic peoples of the East as subhuman resources to be exploited or eliminated. They came with that weight and they expressed it. The mass rape of Berlin's civilian population, estimated at between 100,000 and 130,000 women, was the largest single act of sexual violence in recorded history. Stalin called it a trifle. Soviet official history denied it for decades.
The men who committed these crimes were not monsters in any useful sense of the word. They were soldiers who survived things that had no name yet, carrying a weight that had no outlet except the one they found. This does not explain it. It does not excuse it. It simply places it in the context of what total war actually produces when it runs its full course. Not the clean resolution of the history books, but the specific, personal, irreversible damage that violence at this scale does to every human being it touches, on every side, without exception. The bunker was partially destroyed by the Soviets after the war and buried. It was rediscovered during construction work in the 1980s and has been excavated to varying degrees since. Today, there's a parking lot above it. A small information board marks the location. No monument, no museum. The decision was deliberate. The recognition that some places should not become destinations. That the man who occupied the bunker had spent his entire career transforming spaces into symbols, and that the most appropriate response to his final space was to make it ordinary. Berlin survived. The city that Hitler had promised would stand for 1,000 years and that he had ordered defended to the last civilian was rebuilt, divided, occupied, scarred, and then in 1989 reunified into something that bore almost no resemblance to what the regime had intended it to be. The idea that nearly destroyed it did not survive. Not because ideas die easily, they do not. The specific constellation of beliefs that produced the Third Reich, the racial hierarchy, the expansionist nationalism, the cult of will over reality, the certainty that sufficient force applied with sufficient conviction could remake the world in the image of its wielder. These ideas existed before Hitler and continued after it. They exist now in attenuated and mutated forms in places that the post-war world thought it had successfully inoculated against them. But the specific expression of those ideas that stood in that room on April 22nd and screamed and then fell silent, that expression ended in a shell crater in the Reich Chancellery garden, burned with aviation fuel, the ashes scattered so that no grave could become a shrine. The city above it rebuilt itself, block by block, decade by decade, the way cities always rebuild, not by erasing what happened, but by continuing to exist in spite of it. Berlin is still there. The bunker is still there, below the parking lot, below the ordinary surface of a city that chose to be ordinary rather than monumental, because it understood, in a way that the man who built the bunker never did, that monuments to certainty have a way of becoming monuments to ruin. The war started with a voice that said it knew where history was going, that said the destination was inevitable, that said the only question was the will to reach it. The war ended in a room 4 meters wide where that voice finally ran out of things to say. Berlin survived. The certainty that almost destroyed it did not. And the city, which has been many things across its long history, imperial capital, divided city, reunified nation, permanent reminder, continues to exist as proof that what survives is not always what was meant to survive. Sometimes what survives is simply what refused to stop. The bunker is 15 meters below a parking lot. The city is above it. That, in the end, is the only monument that matters.